My name's Ellie Sparrow. What can I say about myself? Aside from being a raging feminist, I'm an actor, a playwright, and a Harry Potter tour guide around London. When I saw the advert for the social experiment at Ahlulbayt TV, I knew this was for me. I'm not religious, but as a feminist, the chance to see what the Qur'an actually says about women was pretty intriguing. Without a doubt, the things we see in the media are exaggerated to sell papers and strike fear. Fear always sells, and the stereotypical sentiments paint the Qur'an as oppressive and sexist. Unfortunately, that narrative is never questioned, but who knows what it actually has to say? Especially when Muslims make up a significant percentage of the world population, even here in the UK, what the Qur'an has to say about women affects us all. I suppose I was picked because of who I am. I'm a feminist, and I try to be as active about it as I possibly can. I campaign and fundraise for various women's charities, and I try to go to all the events and marches I possibly can. But above all, I always try and stand up to casual sexism and never let people get away with it, even if that's not the easy option. I'll happily tell someone to their face that they've crossed a line. That's who I am, and feminism is what I stand for. It's unfortunate, but like most women I know, I've experienced various forms of sexism and objectification, right from when I was 13, to online hate on social media, and of course, the culture in the acting industry. It happens all the time, and it needs to stop. I appreciate that men and women have their differences, but intrinsically we're all the same. We each strive for the same goals, and we all want to be treated with respect and have the same opportunities. Unfortunately, patriarchy and male dominance is not a conspiracy. We see patriarchy everywhere, whether it's in the acting industry or the very obvious disparities in the representation politically and economically. Even now, as we speak, a significant percentage of employers in the UK have vastly disproportionate salaries based on gender. Even at the BBC, men make up the most well-paid jobs. It's not even a secret. They publish it themselves. With that said, I suppose it becomes quite clear why I was chosen for this experiment. The producers thought that if anyone was to test what the Qur'an has to say about women objectively, then it would make sense to have an individual with my background and principles. My journey began at the Pre-Islamic Center, where the producers brought me to hear the Qur'an in Arabic for the first time. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alif Lam Mim. ذلك الكتاب لا ريب فيه هدى للمتقين الذين يؤمنون بالغيب ويقيمون الصلاة ومما رزقناهم ينفقون. It's difficult to explain how the words made me feel. I'd never heard anything like it before. It was definitely very unique. It was surprisingly a lot more musical than I'd expected. I tried to gather my thoughts as I listened to it. It was similar to when I do yoga, but the words invoked more feeling than they did any thoughts. It's hard to explain. However, one thing was for sure. Listening to the Arabic gave me an even greater urge to see what it said about women. However, before that, I thought it would be good to get some perspective. I wanted to see what the public thought of this experiment. What did they think I would find in the Qur'an?
Well, from my perspective, they treat the women, bad or very archaic in the sense that they're not allowed to do certain things. From what I've heard on social media, like in Saudi Arabia, they're not allowed to drive. Certain things they're not allowed to do. Or freedom to express themselves as they are over here. Very old-fashioned views. But I suppose you could say the same thing if you read the Bible, or, you know what I mean? Or, I know they practice it, where you can marry multiple women and all this and that, you know.
You will not find happy things, I'm sure of it. I'm a quite woman, respectful guy. I really appreciate women, especially for part of my mom. But for what I believe and what I know, you won't be happy. You won't be really happy about it, especially if you're girls that live in London and here, you know, women are quite free.
And for women, I think it keeps them guarded, really.
Some individuals didn't want to be directly on camera, but shared the same pessimistic vibe.
I've certainly heard some Muslim commentators talk about content that sounded very passive to me.
Fair enough.
That's where I live.
I suppose my views on that would be based more on women's rights in countries that I know are strongly Muslim, so like Saudi Arabia and Afghanistan, and their rights in those countries compared to here.
It was sad in a way. None of the individuals we met had actually read the Quran, but each of them felt like it would be regressive. I appreciate that it will probably come across quite old-fashioned, but it seems like most people had already had their minds made up. The producers gave me a few different translations and then sent me all the verses that referred to women in general, but not the verses about specific women. For example, there were no verses on Mary, the mother of Jesus, who incidentally has a whole chapter named after her. Either way, there were definitely more verses than I thought there would be.
So I've just read all these verses for the first time. I've been provided with all the verses about women, and I've been provided with two different translations, which has been very interesting. One of these translations is by a man, and one of them is the only English translation by a woman. And there's some very different stuff in both of the translations, so I can already start seeing the problems that you have when something is translated. Like, people will take it to mean different things, and you'll end up with a very, very, very different bit of text at the end. One thing that really stood out to me is that there is a whole chapter on divorce, which a lot of religious texts kind of deny is even a thing. There's also a lot of things saying that the woman can choose to leave if she wants to. There's a lot of choice within that. You're not just held in a marriage for the rest of your life, which obviously has been a problem for women, especially in this country. Like, women who were married didn't really have a lot of their own rights for a long time, which is another thing that stood out in these quotes. There's a lot about women having rights to their own money, which wasn't a thing in this country until the Marriage Protection Act was brought in 1870. That was the first time that married women had rights to their own money. So before that, a woman could earn money, but it was technically her husband's because she was married to him. So, and this was written in like the 600s. So the idea of women having rights to their own money is such a radical thing in terms of the time period, and actually like amazingly progressive. There's a lot of choice within marriage, and a lot of, you can get out and you will have money to get out with, which is huge. And also actively against forced marriage. There's a lot of quotes about not holding a woman against her will, not inheriting a woman against her will. Like, it's got to all be her choice, which, is not always a thing. And it's a lot more progressive than I was expecting it to be on that front. And it sort of actively corrects a lot of problems from before as well. Like with female infanticide, there are a lot of quotes about that is a sin, you shouldn't do that. If you bury a baby girl, she will be asked what sin she committed and why you buried her. So there's a lot of very emotive stuff about that. A thing that stood out to me as not so good was this quote: "Men shall take full care of women with the bounties which God has bestowed more abundantly on the former than on the latter." I have questions. So basically, men are in charge of taking care of women, which suggests that men are strong and women are weak, which is not true. It's one of those things that's flagged up to me as very sort of putting women in a box of being childish and weak and needing to be taken care of, when obviously that's not the case. And also the bounties which God has bestowed more abundantly on the former than the latter. Like, what are these bounties that have been bestowed on men? Are they just supposed to be naturally stronger? Are they supposed to be naturally better so that they have to take care of the poor little weak women? Like, what is this? Or is this referring to something actually specific? Like, this is something that I'd like to ask people about, because to me this looks sexist, but equally I need more information. And I mean, this whole verse is a thing I think we're going to be talking a lot about. This is verse 434. This is the bit that is quite famous, because this is the bit that is quite often translated as basically, if you're having a problem with your wife, it says admonish them, then leave them alone in bed, so like sleep separately for a while, then beat them, basically, is quite a common translation. But I've just found out from reading this that that's not always actually correct, because a lot of people don't translate that word as beat. A lot of people translate that word as go away or leave quickly, which would make sense. Like if you're having a problem with your wife, have a bit of space. That's quite a normal thing. But why is there so much difference in this translation? Like, why does one of these advocate domestic violence and why does one of them not? Like, what does the Quran actually say?
The producers also gave me the verses that described life for women before the Quran. Things were definitely worse than I expected. Women were basically property, not people. I also took it upon myself to read a little wider, to really try and understand what it was like for women. Some of the things I read were quite shocking. To discuss this further, my first interview was with Lala Bakhtiar, the female translator I mentioned previously.
The Quran has a few descriptions when it comes to the status of women in pre-Islamic Arabia. Verses describe the disappointment when a girl is born, as well as female infanticide. Verses also describe the practice of likening one's wife to their mother, where wives are abandoned in the home, deprived of their emotional and physical needs. Verses also put a stop to sons inheriting their father's wives, as well as scenarios where women were limited to cattle that had been stillborn and not healthy livestock. How would you describe life for women in pre-Islamic Arabia?
Well, actually, you've described it very well. I mean, you brought out the main points of what was, the life of a woman in pre-Islamic Arabia, and particularly the bearing of female children alive was a terrible, terrible tragedy and oppressive state that women had to go through. So I don't really have much to add to what you've already said. I think you put it very clearly.
Okay, how revolutionary was Islam when it came to women's rights? Was there patriarchal resistance to Islam?
Well, the resistance to Islam was basically from the Quraysh tribespeople, who certainly did follow all of the practices that opposed women's rights, whereas the Prophet was wonderful. I mean, he loved women and he was kind to them, and he was very close to his first wife. He lived with her for 25 years, and she was his soulmate, you might say, and then he was also his daughter, Fatima, who he was very close to, and the way he behaved towards her was very different from how the other Quraysh related towards their daughters. So in addition to the Quran giving rights to women, he also practiced, being good to women and giving women their rights.
Yeah, he practiced what he preached in a way. So, yeah that's nice.
He walked the walk and talked the talk.
He did. Okay. So, what inspired you to translate the Quran?
Well, it was, I was writing a life of the Prophet, and I had finished the life of the Prophet. Then one day I looked at it and I thought, well, no, how can this be the life of the Prophet? It doesn't contain the whole of the Quran. It's just got, bits and pieces of the Quran. And yet his whole life was the whole of the Quran. So I then looked at English translations of the Quran, and in each case I could find so many problems with them and so forth that I decided, no, I guess I have to translate the Quran myself. But it didn't occur to me that, well, I'm a woman too, I should do this. That never came in my mind. It was more as a scholar approaching the text, and I felt it was very important to me that this be considered a scholarly translation and not because I'm a woman. I didn't want to be, designated as a woman separate from men translator.
Yeah, you didn't want to be the female voice for the Quran.
Yes. Just as valid as if I had been a man. It didn't matter.
No, I entirely agree with you. It shouldn't be seen as a different thing because it's translated by a woman. That shouldn't be.
Yes.
So, were there any verses you feel you interpreted differently to previous translations of the Quran because you translated it from a female viewpoint?
The main one is chapter 4, verse 34, where it has previously been interpreted as husbands who fear resistance, but they don't use the word resistance. They use another word like disobedience on the part of their wives. They counsel them, then they leave their bed, and then they beat them. So I knew that the God that I love is not letting anyone beat anyone. So I took quite a long time doing research on the different words, and particularly the word daraba, and found that it has 26 meanings, and one of the other meanings of it is to go away. This is in the Taj al-Aruz, which is one of the famous Arabic dictionaries and lexicons. So when I looked at the life of the Prophet, there was an incident in his life when two of the wives had kind of gotten together and were, in a way, denigrating him somewhat. And so the Quran actually revealed to him about this story, and he then left them for 1 month. So he went away when he was unhappy with what they were doing. He didn't beat anyone or so forth. So it seemed to me that this had been a misinterpretation. And also, you create a contradiction with another verse of the Quran. Surah Baqarah, verse 231. It says, and when you divorced wives and they reached their term, hold them back as one who is honorable, or set them free as one who is honorable. But hold them not back by injuring them or causing them any kind of harm, so that you commit aggression. And whoever commits that, then surely he did wrong to himself. So when we reflect back and we see, okay, this is a woman who's about to be divorced, cannot be harmed. And then we say, okay, but a Muslim woman who wants to remain married does so under the threat of being beaten.
Yeah, it's all a bit off. Yeah.
This contradicts the other, yes. So in Quranic scholarship, anytime you can prove that one interpretation contradicts another verse's interpretation, then you know you're not on the right track. You know that you've created that contradiction, that it's not actually there in the verse itself. You've misunderstood it, in other words. I certainly have seen here in Chicago implications of what happens of misinterpreting this verse. There have been, because we have a bookstore here, and there have been people who've come in who are going to be getting married, and they open the Quran and they show it to the girl, the fiancé. You see, if you don't obey me, I can beat you. And this is, very discouraging that someone would think that and even open the Quran to say this, and you can just see, you can imagine where it's going to go down the line and where this is going to end up.
Verse 434 was now clearly a point of contention, not to mention contradiction with other verses. Why has it been translated so widely as beat when the word itself has so many possible meanings? With the help of the producers, I checked out some other Arabic dictionaries and they confirmed what Dr. Lala said. All these famous dictionaries said the root word for beat can also mean to leave in haste, to go far away, to leave a thing alone, to walk quickly, or even abandon. It's hard to understand, to be honest. Why do the vast majority of translations hold on to the interpretation that 434 advocates domestic violence? Is this what the Quran intended? I've come to the Islamic College of Advanced Studies in Willesden to meet Dr. Hanfar, who specialises in Islamic law. He too feels prevailing translations are inconsistent.
So we've been talking a lot about verse 434, which is the one a lot of people talk about because quite a lot of people think it refers to the fact that a man should beat his wife if she's done something wrong. However, the word for beat is also interpreted as go away or leave quickly. And you interpret it as go away or leave quickly. Why do you interpret it this way? Like, why do you feel it's that?
If we are talking about a permission given by the Quran for the husband to beat his wife, then we are talking about a contradiction in this very verse that وَمِنْ آيَاتِهِ أَنْ خَلَقَ لَكُم مِّنْ أَنفُسِكُمْ أَزْوَاجًا لِتَسْكُنُوا إِلَيْهَا. You have the safety and the security, and violence wouldn't give really the safety and security. وَجَعَلَ بَيْنَكُمْ مَوَدَّةً وَرَحْمَةً. So he created the tranquility, the affection, and the mercy. And I don't see any kind of mercy would fit really the violence. Now, going through the linguistic structure of the word itself, 58 verses talking about darb and its derivatives in the Quran. Many of them, the vast majority, actually giving us daraba or yadribu in the context of giving an example. The other one, it's taking yourself away or traveling away or leaving the same place. This is the other context. The other things which we have to focus on, that in the Prophet's life, he never really used any violence. Even there was no report whatsoever saying that the Prophet even had shouted at one of his wives, and nothing was documented in the Quran. All the Quran documented that he had argument with his wives, he left the house.
Yeah.
And Quran is documenting
Which is
that.
fairly sensible, really. Like, from what we're talking about with 434, it seems very, very unlikely that it actually means to beat your wife. But why do you think so many people have interpreted it as beats? Like, where does that come from? Does that come from, you know, horrible patriarchal men trying to get power? Like, why?
Patriarchy is one of the main issues, and we have to admit, based on the sociological studies, the human community has never been really tolerant from this kind of patriarchy. We are still in this country, for example, have this kind of patriarchy, maybe in the lighter version, but talking about, for example, the wages, it is kind of a reflection, although it is a silent reflection of the patriarchy. The other thing, that if we look at the modern communities, especially in the Muslim communities, we would find this is something really very much related to the traditions rather the religion. Yeah. Now, from the Islamic perspective, or more specific from the Quranic perspective, is talking all the time about the equality. He never really mentioned a man without mentioning a woman, and vice versa.
Yeah, there's a lot of verses with men and women side by side. Yeah,
he's telling us all the time that the equality should be really one of the substantial issues to be cared of within the family. And I did have this discussion with many people in different conferences, saying, well, we don't actually practice the domestic violence against our wives, but as a matter of fact, we would like to understand that we are given the authority in the Quran to do so.
Oh, God.
So it is like, I would like to have this authority even if I'm not using it. So I think it's coming from
even if he's not using the authority, that's still a huge thing within a relationship, though,
Absolutely.
isn't it? To know that your husband could beat you if he wanted to and be backed up, like that's huge.
And it could leave a lot of negative impacts deep inside.
Absolutely.
Both Dr. Lala and Dr. Khanfar made it clear that interpreting the verses beat contradicts other verses as well as the behaviour of the Prophet himself. In fact, both mentioned an instance outlined in chapter 66, verses 1 to 5, where the Prophet was upset with two of his wives and he reacted by leaving them for some time. It's concerning that the actual example of the Prophet is being overlooked, while the understanding that advocated domestic violence is being used as a tool to suppress women, to remind them that the Quran gives their husband the right to beat them. The producers next put me in touch with Dr. Masooma Jaffer. She is the resident female scholar at Stanmore Islamic Centre, one of the largest communities in London. She's also co-authored a book on Quranic sciences with her husband. But the main reason we were here is because she is a marriage counsellor.
We're going to talk about verse 434. So the first bit of it says that men are supporters, or men should take full care of women because with the bounties that have been bestowed more abundantly on the former than the latter. So these bounties have supposedly been bestowed more on men. So that kind of sounds like they've been given some sort of advantage. Like, what do you interpret these bounties to be like?
So what it's saying is that men have to maintain women. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
so Islamically, the financial maintenance of a woman is on the man, be it her father when she's unmarried, her husband when she's married, her sons if they're older and her husband's not there anymore, or it could be her uncles, her grandfather, any of the male folk of the family have to take care of the women. A woman should not be forced to go out to work in Islam. It's her choice. And when she does work, whatever she earns is her money. Her husband has no right to that money. And so much so that he still has to maintain her even if she's earning.
Interesting.
But if I and my husband decide that I will be the one who goes out and works and he sits at home and takes care of the children. As long as we've decided that, and I'm happy with that and he's happy with that, then there's no problem.
Oh, cool. Okay.
But it's not something that he can tell me to do.
Yeah.
Because Islamically, it is my right for him to take care of me. That's the right that God's given me. And there are certain rights that have been given to him, which again, if you look at it just on its own, then it feels like, oh, men have so many more rights. But if you look at it on its own, then it feels like a woman's got so many rights. But if you put them all together, then it balances out.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Fair enough. Okay, I'm going to talk about the rest of 434. Basically says, along the lines of, if you have a problem with your wife, first admonish her, then leave her in the sleeping places, so sleep separately for a bit. And then in some translations, it says you should then beat her. And in other translations, it says you should go away or leave quickly or sort of have some space for a bit.
If you look at the continuation of the verse, okay, so it says, counsel them, leave them alone in the sleeping places, and then hit them or beat them or whatever. Then if they obey you, do not seek a way against them. So come together again.
Yeah.
So the idea is to come back together. Now, forget about counselling. As a normal person, if you're going to hit your wife,
she's not going to come back.
Exactly.
Let's be honest.
Yeah. So it doesn't flow with the rest of the verse. A lot of the scholars will turn around and say this is actually leave or go away. Then it's not. Actually just maybe move right away from them and send them away, so that then there's that total separation, and maybe that's what they need. Yeah. And maybe that's what they need.
While this verse dominates so much of the discussion, the Quran actually has 31 verses that deal with marital relations. From who you can marry, how to propose, the dowry, the love that God instills in marriage, polygamy, and so much more. Of all the verses, I really like chapter 2, verse 187. It describes the husband and wife as a garment for one another. I feel like there's so much meaning and symbolism behind that verse. It feels very equal to me. Another verse that was quite interesting is chapter 2, verse 223. Some individuals believe that this verse gives the husband the right to sleep with his wife whenever he wants, which obviously brings up massive issues with consent. It says, "Your wives are your tilth. Go then unto your tilth as you may desire." When I first read this verse, I thought it was degrading. Why is it reducing a wife to something that can be owned? All the translations I checked pointed to this narrative. I then had to check the commentaries I was given. In the study Quran, it said that this verse was revealed when men from Mecca came to the Prophet and said their wives, who were from Medina, were unsure about some of the Meccan customs when it came to foreplay and intercourse. According to narrations, the above verse was revealed, making it clear that there were no restrictions in terms of foreplay and intercourse. The commentary also explains that tilth, in the context of the 7th century, would be land that would be loved, cherished, and looked after. It also refers to the idea of offspring. I found this whole episode so interesting. The fact that the Quran speaks so openly about such issues, and the fact that people were so comfortable to ask the Prophet such intimate questions.
So verse 425 talks about to marry them then with their people's leave. Does this mean that marriage needs consent?
So the verse itself is actually talking about slave girls.
Okay.
But within Islam, if a girl is a virgin and she's being taken care of by her father financially and being supported by her father, then she does need her father's permission to get married. But if the father is refusing for no apparent reason, or
like if there's not good ground, sort of thing.
Yes, or for superficial reasons. So, for example, she wants to marry someone who's a decent guy, who's religious, but he's not rich, and the father's saying, "No, I want you to marry someone rich." Then she can actually contest that.
She can say, "No, I want to marry him,"
and she can contest that. So, but she cannot be forced into marriage. So even if the father approves, the proposal is by the woman and the acceptance is by the man. So if she's being forced, she's not actually proposing.
Because there's not the acceptance. Yeah. Which actually brings me on pretty neatly to my next question, which is, I kind of, when I first started reading verses about women in the Quran, because, that's what I've been doing, I was aware of this cultural thing of forced marriage, and I have looked it up on the Muslim Women's Network to check that I wasn't just massively stereotyping and being a horrible person. But There are supposedly about 400 cases of forced marriage in the UK every year, mostly from Islamic communities. Not completely from Islamic communities, but there are a lot within that. And there are a lot of verses in the Quran that says, like, it's not marriage if the woman doesn't accept. You can't inherit a woman through coercion. Like, if a woman wants a divorce, she should be let go fairly. Like, do not hold a woman against her will. There are so many verses that very specifically say, do not force a woman to marry you. Like, why do you think this is still happening? Like,
honestly, it's because of culture.
Yeah,
I think the sad thing is a lot of Muslims live a cultural Islam rather than the real Islam. And the sad thing is both men and women perpetuate that because women themselves don't know their rights according to Islam. And that's on them. They should know what rights they have. So if they know that they can't be forced into marriage, then they can sit there and say, "Excuse, no, you can't do this to me."
The problem that you then get is in the countries where there's lower rates of education in women, there's lower rates of literacy in women, so women physically can't educate themselves. I think that's where you get the real proper issues with it, because a man will go, "Oh, it says this in the Quran," and she'll have to go, "Okay, I can't read." That's the really sad thing.
And this is why Islam, when it talks about education. And to seek education, it's not confined to men or women. It is for all. It's actually a obligatory action that is on both men and women.
So something that really struck me when I first started, reading the passages on women and that kind of thing, is that the Quran literally has an entire chapter on divorce. Like, having come from, reading religious texts like the Bible and that kind of thing, where divorce is something that just doesn't happen.
Islam does allow divorce because it sees that there is a need for divorce. For whatever reason, you may have married the wrong person, you may not get on, you may be in an abusive relationship. There are so many different reasons you would want to get divorced, but at the same time, it does say that you should not enter into it lightly. But it is allowed because it is needed, I think.
I completely agree with you. I thought it was actually like a really great and progressive thing within the Quran that divorce is acknowledged and is allowed, and sometimes marriages don't work and both parties aren't going to be happy, and like, it's horrible, but it happens. I thought that was actually a really nice thing. Also, there's a lot of making sure that you don't leave somebody badly, if that makes any sense. Like, there's a lot of stuff about making sure you're both okay and making sure that you don't just cast somebody out onto the streets and that kind of thing, and like even child maintenance and that kind of thing. It's all very like nicely regulated, which was a thing that really, really struck me in reading it. I thought that was very, very progressive, actually, very cool. Like, verse 4:3 mentions that men can take up to 4 wives if they like, as long as they're treated fairly. But obviously women can't take more than one husband. So like, do you think this is fair? Like,
okay. So my understanding and my take on this verse is that there are less men than women.
Something like 51% female.
Yeah. So there are for a woman to have a husband, if there isn't enough men there for each woman to have a husband, she loses out on experiencing that love of marriage, because she can't. Within Islam, you can't have a relationship outside marriage. She loses out on having children, because again, she couldn't do that without marriage.
Yeah, because you can't have a relationship.
Yeah. So for the sake of the woman, I feel that this is there for her rather than for the guy. And if you look at it within society, if it was such an amazing thing for guys, most Muslim men would have more than one wife. Most Muslim men don't.
Yeah, true.
Because of the fact that God has put that condition that you have to maintain justice.
You have to treat them fairly.
Yeah. So that is very, very difficult to do. The condition that God puts in, He doesn't say if you can't keep justice, if you feel you cannot keep justice. So don't even go down that route.
Yeah.
If you think you're not gonna,
and
exactly.
then if it goes wrong,
exactly.
divorce.
So you know who you are. You know what sort of person you are. You know why you want to marry another person, and if you're going to marry another person because she's younger or she's more beautiful, there's no way you're going to be able to keep justice. Yeah. So if you feel you're not going to be able to keep justice, forget it. This isn't for you. Then just marry one, and God's giving you that. Just marry one.
It's also, as far as I understand, with again the polyamory marriage sort of thing. As far as I understand, your first wife has to agree. Or am I wrong about that? Ooh, talk to me.
He doesn't have to have her permission if he's going to marry a Muslim.
So he can do it when she doesn't want
But
him to.
she can put that in her...
in her contract.
In her marital contract before marriage, if that's what she decides to do.
The marriage contract is a very interesting and progressive concept in Islam, especially in the context of the period of revelation. From a time where women were inherited to now actually stipulating the terms of marriage. It highlights the shift the Qur'an established. Moreover, on 3 occasions the Qur'an says that the wife is to be given a dowry as part of the marriage contract. This is hers to keep all to herself. What's more, other verses warn the husband from trying to reclaim it, even after divorce. This means the Qur'an is setting in stone a wife's monetary independence. In the UK, this wasn't the case until 1870. Before then, anything a wife earned was automatically the property of her husband. That's unbelievable when you come to think of it, especially as I take such pride in my career. I have 3 jobs and I love each of them, particularly my playwriting. It's a difficult industry, but me and my writing partner recently got a show funded by the Arts Council, and slowly but surely we see ourselves progressing in the industry. I have great ambitions, and it all comes down to hard work, and being a woman is even more difficult. The industry is so male-dominated, and as women we need to push even harder. To my surprise, chapter 4 verse 32 made clear, men shall have a benefit from what they earn, and women shall have a benefit from what they earn. While various commentaries indicate this refers to good deeds like praying and charity, it is also understood to refer to worldly earnings, where women will literally benefit from what they earn. The producers have put me in touch with Dr. Kautha, who is a GP in Slough. I wanted to know how she understands what the Qur'an has to say about careers and monetary independence.
The Qur'an sort of very clearly puts the responsibility of family upkeep on the man of the house. And whilst this has sort of good intentions, and we've talked a lot about women having the right to be cared for and this sort of thing, and it all seems to come from quite a good place, do you think ultimately this sort of feeds the patriarchy and kind of leads to a more patriarchal slant on families and on society and that kind of thing?
I don't see how the two equate personally. I think we live in a very patriarchal world. I don't think there's anywhere that isn't. Unfortunately, they still talk about gender pay gaps and still talk about Me Too and campaign and all of that in the West. So I personally don't see how giving the man the financial responsibility for the upkeep of the house would do that. And women are still very much independent, and actually through allowing her to be able to spend her money as she wishes gives her a different sense of independence. It's very clear in the rest of the Quran that the only thing that matters is obviously your relationship with God. And at the end of the day, in one of the verses in Surah Al-Hujarat, it says, to be created for male and female, the best of you is which is more God conscious. And so if there are physical attributes, or if there are things that women have been given advantage over men, or men have been given advantage over women, then and
they're kind of by the wayside in a way.
They are physical, but they're not our core. They're not who we are. They're not what matter.
They're not our soul.
They're not matter ultimately.
As Dr. Kautha said, chapter 49 verse 13 makes it clear that in the eyes of God, it's piety that distinguishes an individual. But I just wonder whether the wording here, where a man is favoured, is open for misuse and manipulation, where patriarchy could use this to undermine women. Also the idea that the favour refers to strength. I'm just not sure, to be honest. There are clearly some women stronger than their male partners. I don't know. I guess it's open for interpretation. Having said that, one of the interpretations I came across suggested that this favour is linked to chapter 4 verse 176, which basically says a man gets twice the inheritance of a woman.
Again, following on from these passages, the Quran says quite clearly that a son is to inherit twice what a daughter inherits. What are your thoughts on this? How do you feel?
So traditionally there's 2 reasons why this is the case. So the first is that a man, it's supposed to be a man's financial, it's supposed to be his responsibility solely for the finances of the household. So, you know, if he were to inherit that double the amount that he inherits over the sister, he's supposed to then spend on his wife and his kids, whereas the sister or the girl is under no obligation to do so. So she can then use of the money to whatever she wants. She can do whatever she wants with the money. So that's one of the reasons why. And then the other reason is obviously because of the fact that a man is obligated to pay a dowry towards his wife, and the wife can stipulate how much that can be. That can, you know, that's another gift that the man is giving his wife. So whatever the woman gets is for herself. Essentially, there's no reason or responsibility or obligation on her to spend that on the family, whereas the male, it's his sole obligation. That's the traditional sort of reasons why.
With that said, the other contentious issue that is easily exploited by Islamophobes would be chapter 2, verse 282. It's the verse that says the testimony of the man is equal to 2 females. I can't really get my head around this verse, to be honest, but based on the commentaries I've read, this verse is about money being borrowed between 2 parties.
The initial advice is to get 2 male witnesses. This tells me that a man had approached the Prophet for advice about borrowing money, and then this verse was revealed. Maybe if a woman had asked this question, the verse would have begun by saying, get 2 female witnesses.
The verse advises to get 2 witnesses from amongst your men. This tells me that both parties can choose their witness. The verse then says that if you can't find 2 men, get 1 man and 2 women. Again, this tells me that both sides can choose their female witness. The verse then says that if one of them errs or forgets, then one can remind the other. Now, is this verse saying that women are forgetful? That doesn't seem particularly fair to me. The optimist in me says it's possible that any one of them could forget, men or women, and that's why it says get 2 men in the first place, so they can remind one another. Ultimately, I guess 2 witnesses are better than 1. I can also see how some women may be more comfortable to confer amongst other women, especially when there is threat of duress, again, bearing in mind we're talking about the 7th century. I'd be more concerned about this verse had there not been other instances where the gender of the witness is not relevant. For example, chapter 4 verse 15 and chapter 24 verses 6 to 9. Both are examples where the gender of the witness is not particularly relevant. I'm also inclined to reserve judgment because of the sheer number of verses that refer to men and women side by side. In total, there are 28 verses which purposely refer to men and women when it was probably not necessary. The most memorable of these is chapter 33, verse 35. The verse says, "For men and women who are devoted to God, believing men and women, obedient men and women, truthful men and women, steadfast men and women, humble men and women, charitable men and women, fasting men and women, chaste men and women who remember God often, God has prepared forgiveness and a rich reward." The commentary behind this verse is especially interesting. It was revealed when Salama returned to Medina after a few years away. She asked some of the wives of the Prophet whether anything had been revealed about women while she'd been away. When told that there hadn't, she went and complained to the Prophet. The above verse was then revealed, putting men and women side by side.
This really struck a chord with me. From my experience, if someone complains that something isn't inclusive enough, they usually get shut down. However, here, you have a lady comfortable enough to go and complain to the Prophet, who was technically the head of state at that point, and her concerns were addressed so emphatically.
My next meeting is with Dr. Rebecca Masterton, an English revert to Islam. I'm so tempted to ask her about every verse, but when I think about the change she's made, the first thing that comes to mind is the hijab and her choice to make such a change to her appearance.
We're going to talk a little bit about verse 24-31, the one about not displaying your charms in public and all that kind of stuff, and drawing your head covering over your bosoms and all that kind of thing. Now, at the time, like a woman with her hair out would have been seen as quite risque, like that would have been seen as quite promiscuous. But like often in the world today, like women with their hair out really isn't a big deal. Like women walk around with their hair out all the time and we don't really think anything of it. Do you think that forms any basis as to like how we should interpret this verse now? Like, should we interpret it differently?
When we look at pre-Islamic society, it was mainly, as the sources say, it was mainly prostitutes and slaves who were uncovered. So there may have been that connotation, but I think that today a woman's hair is still very much a site of discussion, and as an example, women still try to make their hair look attractive, or to dye their hair, or to style their hair in a way to improve, how they look and their appearance. So by her friends.
An adornment then, by like the words that are used.
Yeah, I think. I mean, it is kind of, obviously in many societies around the world, it is acceptable for a woman to show her hair, but its attractiveness is still an issue, and that can affect, like you say, her job prospects. As
I guess
well.
in a way, still an adornment then, by like the words that are used.
Yeah, I think. I mean, it is kind of, obviously in many societies around the world, it is acceptable for a woman to show her hair, but its attractiveness is still an issue, and that can affect, like you say, her job prospects as well.
In verse 33:59, the one that talks about covering yourself in swathes of clothing if you're a woman, I can't remember the exact wording, and it says that doing so will be more conducive to being recognised as a decent woman and not annoyed. Now, I read this and felt that it was slightly like victim blamey, like in terms of putting the onus on a woman not to be harassed. Whereas I kind of feel like the onus should be on a man not to harass her, and there should be a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I mean, I've been harassed in the workplace, I've been harassed on the street, I've comments made at me on the street, social environment, harassed in the social environment, pretty much everywhere. And I found that covering, it just all stopped. It literally stopped. I get a lot of respect, especially living in the inner city. I get respect from men from different backgrounds, like, they'll open the door for you, or they let you go on the bus first, or they, just in terms of like the way they walk past you. I even had an occasion where there were two men actually on this grass verge fighting. As I walked past, they stood to attention and they said, sorry.
That's so interesting. God.
So, yeah, I mean, I was just walking past, and I thought to myself, it had the effect of them kind of, thinking that they had to be on their best behaviour. It doesn't guarantee that a woman's not going to be harassed.
Oh, there are idiots everywhere.
Sometimes it is talked about as kind of, well, if you cover, that's it, as a guarantee against rape or sexual harassment, or it's not a guarantee. You can go to Muslim countries and you'll still be, harassed, but in some ways, at least, it kind of minimises that, or goes some way to minimising that. It sets up a clear boundary. And it's a kind of a clear message that, no, you can't look at me, you can't approach me, you can't touch me. And I think in Islam there's very much this idea of the gaze as well. I mean, we talk about, obviously, the male gaze, the objectification of women in the male gaze. And Islam almost sees like the gaze as having some kind of spiritual effect upon people. So if you have, if someone's looking at you with jealousy, that's seen to have a potentially harmful effect on that person. So if someone is gazing at someone, I mean, again, in many societies, well, what's the big deal? He just looked at her, he just glanced at her, or, but that's actually seen from an Islamic perspective as a violation. It's a huge violation for a man to look at a woman and imagine, her sort of, in a way that he shouldn't be.
Yeah. That in itself is seen as an act.
Yeah. It's a violation. So,
I do get where you're coming from with that. It's an interesting thing because, in a way, like, I still think that we should be shaming the people who do it rather than changing ourselves. But also, I entirely understand why you would be like, bugger being harassed. Like, I do get it. Like, but like it makes a lot of sense. And like, I'm not anti-hijab at all. Like, I think if you want to wear it, you should be able to wear it. Like, I think it's choice, personal choice is great.
I really enjoyed my meeting with Dr. Rebecca. I feel like we had so much in common, and I completely get why she made the choice that she did. The vibe I get from her is that even if the Quran didn't say to cover up, she probably still would. I completely get that, and even if it's not the full hijab, modest fashion has become a massive deal. Major retailers like Marks & Spencer's, Debenhams, and H&M have long been stocking modest fashion lines, not just targeting Muslim shoppers, but the wider society also. It really is becoming a growing trend where women are finding more comfort in modesty. Having said that, choice is the key. If a woman is being forced, then I completely disagree with that, whether it's the hijab, or a bikini, or even no clothes at all. It also frustrates me that just because men can't control themselves, women have to cover up. Dr. Rebecca may feel this is a realistic assessment, but A, not all men are like this, and B, it gives the ones that are an excuse, and if they have an excuse, how will they change? I appreciate the fact that the Quran tells men to lower their gaze in verse 24-30, but it's the women who are told to cover up so that they won't be annoyed. The onus should be on men to keep themselves to themselves regardless of what a woman is wearing. On my final day, the channel invited me back to the studio to speak with some of the female members of staff. I wanted to get the perspective of regular Muslim women to see how they understand the verses.
I think before I probably would have thought that it's very sexist, as in I feel like women were being portrayed in a negative light, but having done research, having looked into different verses and different translations of those verses, I've changed my opinion. Could you have something you want to say?
I think, certainly, I don't think it portrays women in a negative light. The female personality is mentioned in the Qur'an. I think that is really uplifting to see there's some very, very powerful women. But there are verses that are really open to interpretation and it could be seen in a negative light.
So we talked about like verses or people in the Quran that are positive towards gender equality. Do you feel, like, are there any bits that you feel are a bit more negative? Do you feel any bits of it are particularly sexist?
So I think definitely I did look at some verses and say, is this equality to women, like the inheritance, you know. But there's even now scholars in this day and age questioning this and saying that the female is also financially in charge of the household. So could we adjust this? So, but I think we all, at some point, probably looked at a verse and said, oh, wait a minute, that doesn't make sense. Yeah. But I think it does make sense when we research more into it, and that's been my journey.
I think a lot of people will probably say Islam condones domestic violence. With regards to Islam, we look at lots of many different factors. So we look at prophetic practice, we look at prophetic sayings, and we also look at the Quran. So there's different aspects. When we look at what the Prophet, the way he lived his life with his wives and the things that he said, when he was asked about how to treat your wives or how to treat women, he specifically said, you know, do not beat them, do not revile them. He said, clothe them when you clothe yourself and feed them when you feed yourself. So it's really important that if the Prophet of Islam is advocating no domestic violence towards women, treating them fairly, treating them, you know, in a good way, you take that and then you look at the verse and think it does not make sense that the Prophet would be advocating something and the Quran says something else. And there are loads of people coming out with translations to say that there's a different meaning for that. So that's that verse, I'd say, in answer to that question.
Yeah, it's a huge thing. We've had a lot of chats about that particular verse because some people say that that word means you should beat her, and some people say that word means you should go away from her for a bit.
My sister was involved in domestic violence, and I wouldn't follow a religion that advocated or encouraged domestic violence to any extent. We definitely live in a male-dominated society, and I think men make a lot of excuse for their actions. So men that feel like they can dominate their wives, they can beat their wives, they will interpret it in that sense. And we have these same personalities in the Muslim community. The Muslim community doesn't represent Islam in general. I would never look at a Muslim and say that's Islam. I would look at the text. So I think some men probably would interpret that so that they can have dominance over their wives and they can have full power. You know, when Islam spread, that a lot of cultures injected their own cultural practices in the religion. Culturally, a lot of men may feel that they should have dominance. So when they interpret the religion, they would interpret it with the viewpoint of culture.
Of I should have dominance.
Yeah, exactly. So a lot of it is culture as well, that they think that they can have dominance. So it's not Islam. So we have to look at Islam purely without culture, without any other influences.
Do you guys feel that the Quran is portrayed as more sexist than it really is by the media right now and the general public?
I think both the Muslim communities and the wider community misinterpret the Quran, and as a result, the media is obviously going to portray it in a negative light.
I've had people come up to me and say, you know, you're submissive, you're oppressed, and I'm like, I don't feel oppressed, and Everyone has a interpretation and has an idea of how a Muslim woman is treated in Islam, and that is not how we feel. There is a lot more that we have to do to bring about awareness and bring about the true message that the Prophet Muhammad brought, rather than the culture that people try to impose. So I would say, even, you know, honor killings, that's got nothing to do with Islam. And
there's nothing about that anywhere.
Nothing about that anywhere. But people portray it as Islamic teachings and about Islam, but it's got nothing to do with that.
And like forced marriage was one that got me. Because like there's this whole culture of forced marriage happening, and obviously I've read a lot of the verses about women, like, you know, I've gone through them and read all the bits about marriage and that kind of thing. There's nothing about forced marriage. It literally says don't do it. Yeah. Like several times it literally says this is bad, don't do that. And it's like, exactly, where is this coming from? Like, exactly. Yeah.
So culturally is arranged marriage, like a forced marriage is seen as acceptable. Islamically it isn't. So I think a lot of people can't understand and make the difference between culture and religion, and that's where the problem lies.
It was actually really interesting to hear their opinions. It was also quite eye-opening, in that they also felt like the religion and the Quran are predominantly taken from a cultural perspective.
I think everyone we spoke to said the same thing, that cultural practice of the religion is so dominant, and in particular patriarchal culture. I understand that a lot of cultures predate the Quran, but it hadn't occurred to me that the culture would sway and often supersede what the Quran so clearly states. Issues such as forced marriage, honour killings, FGM, or the lack of education in some areas where women genuinely don't know what rights the Quran gives them. This is perpetuated by the media, who don't distinguish between the Quran and the culture.
All in all, what can I say? The producers wanted to challenge the Quran from the perspective of a feminist campaigner, one who isn't shy to speak her mind.
If I'm honest, the text was very different to what I thought it would be. It's definitely not how the media paints it. Don't get me wrong, there are aspects I don't agree with.
At the same time, there were various aspects that were really positive. In fact, I was quite surprised at how progressive some of it was. For example, a whole chapter on divorce when Catholicism forbids it completely. Or the idea that a woman has right to her own money, and the absolute damning of forced marriage. I suppose, as a whole, I found it was really trying to correct past errors, where women were treated as property and baby girls were buried alive. It was also really great to talk to different people and really get an insight into people with very different lives to me, who were willing to open up so that people can get a better understanding of their religion. I really appreciate that. Overall, does the Quran pass my feminist challenge? Maybe not entirely, but it did pretty well. It was definitely less sexist than I thought it'd be. You can either take my word for it, or you can actually read it for yourself.